By the early 1970s, every scrapyard in Kestrel County, Kansas, ran on the same arithmetic. You bought the steel by the ton, you stripped what could be resold, and whatever was left over, the dented drums, the corroded tanks, the barrels too rusted through to hold anything ever again, you hauled to whichever farmer at the edge of town would let you dump it for free. Not because anyone had thought hard about the drums, not because there was a plan for them. They were waste. They were the part of the metal that wasn't worth the trouble. And so they went to the back 40 of somebody's land, and the back 40 went quiet every winter, and nobody gave the pile a second thought. That was the logic of Renfrew Salvage and Metal, starting in 1971 and in Kestrel County for the better part of 3 decades after. That logic went unquestioned. Let me tell you about Kestrel County, because you need to understand the ground before you can understand the woman who changed what grew out of it. Kestrel County sits in the flat wheat country of central Kansas, where the land runs so level you can watch weather arrive from 30 miles off, and where, from April through June, what usually arrives is trouble. The county had been hit hard twice in living memory, once in 1966 and once in 1981, enough that every family had a story that started with the sound the sky makes before it turns green. It was not a wealthy county. It has never been. What it had was wheat, sorghum, a grain co-op on the county line, and a scrapyard that had been swallowing the region's dead machinery since 1958. The Marsh family had worked 340 acres on the county's eastern edge since 1949, when Janne's grandfather, a man named Anselm Marsh, had come down from Nebraska with $60 and a flatbed truck and bought the land from a rancher who'd lost his herd to drought and wanted out. Anselm grew wheat and ran cattle on the side pasture. His son, Janne's father, Thaddeus, had added a hog operation and had spent 26 years hauling grain part-time for the co-op, coming home each evening with chaff in his collar and the particular quiet of a man who had never needed an audience to know his day had been worth something. The farm was never the whole income. The farm was the anchor. That distinction mattered in Kestrel County, and it still does. Janne married into that land in 1990, when she was 24, and Curtis Whitmore Marsh, Thaddeus' only son, brought her home from Manhattan, Kansas, where they'd both studied at Kansas State, him in agronomy, her in structural engineering, a degree nobody in the county quite knew what to do with. She had grown up 2 counties over, the daughter of a bridge inspector, and she had spent her childhood learning to read stress and load and failure points the way other kids learn to read weather, too. Curtis died in a combine accident in the fall of 1996, 6 years into their marriage, leaving Janne with the farm, 2 children under the age of 5, and a father-in-law who had just buried his son and did not, in the months that followed, have much left to say to anyone. Janne stayed. She has never fully explained why, even to herself, except to say that the wheat still needed planting whether or not her husband was alive to plant it, and that Thaddeus needed someone in the house who wasn't only grieving. That handshake arrangement had started with Anselm himself, back when he was still alive and had struck a deal with Renfrew's father. Take the drums, do what you want with them, just spare us the tipping fee at the county landfill. Some had been cut up for water troughs. Most had simply piled up along the fence line behind the machine shed. A long, crooked wall of rusted 55-gallon barrels that Janne's children liked to climb on, and that Thaddeus mowed around twice a summer without comment. By the time Janne came to the farm in 1990, the pile held somewhere over 600 drums, and nobody in 3 generations of Marshes had ever thought of it as anything but an eyesore they'd stopped noticing. What Janne noticed in the spring of 1998 Sitting in her kitchen during a tornado watch with her children in the storm cellar, and her heart in her throat because the cellar door had swollen shut in the wet spring ground and had taken 4 minutes to force open. 4 minutes that felt like an hour. Was that Kestrel County had a shelter problem, and that she was looking at 600 solutions rusting in her own back pasture. Let me tell you about the idea itself, because the engineering is the reason any of what follows was possible, and it deserves more than a sentence. A 55-gallon steel drum, properly cleaned, cut, and reinforced, has a wall thickness and a curved shell geometry that distributes wind and debris impact far more efficiently than flat-sheet steel of the same gauge, a principle any structural engineer would recognize immediately, and one that disaster shelter researchers at Texas Tech's Wind Science Center had been documenting since the 1970s in the aftermath of major outbreaks. A single drum alone was not a shelter, but drums welded in overlapping courses, backfilled with rammed earth or reinforced concrete, buried below the frost line with a domed steel roof cap. That configuration, Janne knew from her coursework and from 3 years poring over FEMA's below-ground shelter specifications after Curtis died, could be built to withstand wind loads far beyond anything an EF5 tornado produces at a fraction of the material cost of a poured concrete storm room. The commercial units, being sold by 2 manufacturers out of Oklahoma at the time, ran $4,500 to $7,000 installed. Janne's material cost, if she used what was already rusting on her land, was close to zero. She brought the idea to her father-in-law at the kitchen table in June of 1998. Thaddeus set down his coffee and looked at her the way he'd looked at very little since Curtis's funeral, with actual attention. He did not laugh. Thaddeus Marsh was not a man who laughed at his son's widow, but he did say, with the caution of a man who had learned not to hand out enthusiasm cheaply anymore, that he needed to think about it. Janne knew Thaddeus well enough by then to know what that meant. It meant he wasn't sold, and it meant the barn was hers to try in anyway, because a man who has lost his son does not have the heart left to say no to the boy's widow over a pile of scrap metal nobody wanted in the first place. She found her teacher in a welder named Otis Behrens, 71 years old, who ran a one-man fabrication shop out of a Quonset hut 14 miles east of the Marsh place, and who had built exactly 4 underground shelters in his life, 1 for himself, 1 for his brother, and 2 for neighbors after the 1981 outbreak, using scavenged culvert pipe and whatever steel he could scrounge, because storm shelters were, in Otis's words, not something a Kansas farmer should have to buy from a catalog. Otis charged Janne nothing for the lessons. He told her he'd been wondering for 15 years why nobody had ever asked him to teach it properly. The first thing Otis taught her was how to test a drum. Most of what Renfrau's had been dumping for 2 decades was too corroded through the base to use structurally, good only for scrap. But a portion, drums that had held dry goods rather than chemicals, or had sat under cover rather than in open weather, still had enough sound steel in the shell to be cut, cleaned, and re-welded into a load-bearing lattice. Janne spent the summer of 1998 sorting drums with a hammer and a flashlight, tapping for the dull ring of thinned metal, learning the difference between a barrel that would hold a life and one that would collapse under the weight of the earth around it. She built her first complete shelter, a 6-person unit dug into the slope behind the machine shed, in September of 1998. It took her 11 weeks working nights and weekends. It was overbuilt, heavy, slow, and it worked. Otis inspected it, ran his hand along every weld, and told her, with the brevity of a man who did not hand out compliments he didn't mean, that he'd trust his own grandchildren in it. Now let me pause and ask you something. If you had grown up in a county where the scrapyard was the only place steel went to die, and someone told you they were going to dig the drums back out of a farm woman's fence line and sell them as life safety equipment, what would you think? Because in Kestrel County in 1999, the answer was close to unanimous. The answer was that it was a nice thing for a grieving widow to keep herself busy with. The answer was that real storm shelters came from a supplier in Oklahoma with a brochure, and that scrap was scrap. The loudest version of that answer belonged to Gideon Renfrow. Gideon was 59 in 1999, second-generation owner of Renfrow Salvage and Metal, a 3-acre yard on the county highway that had been swallowing dead trucks, combines, and oil drums since his father founded it. Gideon held informal court most Thursday mornings at the grain co-op's coffee counter, where the county's farmers gathered to complain about diesel prices and compare planting dates. And Janne had taken to going, partly because it was where information moved, and partly because she needed buyers and had none. In March of 1999, she mentioned to the table that she was building below-ground shelters out of reclaimed drums and was looking for anyone who wanted one before storm season. The laughter took about 2 seconds to start. It was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of a man confident that 30 years in the metal business had already taught him everything worth knowing about what steel drums were good for. Gideon said, still grinning, that if there was anything to be made of those drums besides scrap tonnage, his own father would have found it decades ago. He said folks around here bought their shelters from a catalog because a catalog came with a warranty, and a widow's welding hobby did not. Janne didn't raise her voice. She said that Texas Tech's own wind engineering lab had published load data on curved shell steel structures that outperformed flat panel construction at a fraction of the thickness, and that she'd run the numbers on Otis Behrens's 4 existing shelters, none of which had ever failed a load test in 18 years between them. Gideon's smile got smaller, but didn't disappear. He said Kansas wasn't a research lab, and she was welcome to try, but he'd watched plenty of people try things off that same counter over the years, and he knew the difference between an idea and a business. Janne drove home and didn't say much over supper. Thaddeus, who had been quietly watching his daughter-in-law rebuild a life out of the wreckage of his son's death for 3 years, set down his fork that night and said, in the plain way he said things that mattered, that she could clear out the west end of the machine shed for a proper workshop, and that he'd haul what drums she needed with the flatbed. That was Thaddeus's way of saying he was finally on her side. It was not loud. In Kestrel County, it didn't need to be. Let me tell you about the first 3 years because they are unglamorous, slow, and exactly the kind of years that separate the people who build something real from the people who only talk about it. Janne spent the winter of 1999 building a proper fabrication line in the shed. A plasma cutter bought secondhand from an implement dealer going out of business, a welding bay, a concrete mixer for backfill, a set of jigs Otis helped her design so the drum courses would align consistently instead of by eye. She tracked everything in a spiral notebook. Hours per unit, drum salvage per sorted batch, weld inspection failures, concrete cure times by season. By spring of 2000, she had built and sold 3 shelters, priced at $2,900 each, less than half the cost of the Oklahoma catalog units, to neighbors who had watched her build the first one behind the machine shed and decided that watching was enough proof. She had also, without quite planning it, begun keeping a waiting list. In 2001, she completed 11 shelters. Revenue for the year was $27,400, against a materials cost that stayed under $900 because Renfrau's yard was still dumping drums for free and had no idea what they'd become. Her labor hours, tracked at 2,100 for the year, worked out to roughly $13 an hour after materials. Not a living wage yet, but a trajectory her notebook made hard to argue with. She had also made her first contact outside the county, a rural insurance agent in the next county over, a woman named Priscilla Voss, who sold storm and property coverage across 6 counties and had been fielding customer complaints for years about the cost and lead time of commercial shelters. Priscilla drove out to see the operation in October of 2001, spent 40 minutes walking the shed, and asked whether Janne would consider a referral arrangement. Priscilla's agency would recommend Marsh shelters to policyholders in exchange for nothing more than the ability to tell her clients where an affordable, code-compliant option existed. That referral relationship changed the shape of the business. In 2002, revenue reached $61,000. Janne brought on her first employee, a laid-off implement mechanic named Dallas Whitfield, at $9.75 an hour, above the county's manufacturing average. And Dallas told her within a month he intended to stay as long as she'd have him. By 2003, revenue reached $98,500, and Janne had begun working with the County Emergency Management Office to get her shelter design formally reviewed against FEMA's P361 safe room guidelines, a process that took the better part of a year and that Otis Behrens, by then 76 and mostly retired, drove out twice a week to help her document. Let me tell you about a woman named Corinne Byler, because before the storm came, she was the customer who taught Janne what she was actually selling. Corinne farmed alone 40 minutes south of the Marsh place, widowed the same year as Janne, with 3 kids and a root cellar so old the wooden steps had started to rot through. She'd heard about the shelters from Priscilla Voss in the winter of 2002 and had driven out to see one, walking the dugout unit behind the machine shed for the better part of an hour, running her hand along the welded seams the way Janne had once watched Otis do. She didn't ask about the engineering. She asked whether Janne had been scared that first spring after Curtis died, sitting in a cellar with a door that wouldn't open. Janne said yes. Corinne said that was the part the Oklahoma catalog couldn't sell her, somebody who understood exactly what 4 minutes felt like. She bought a shelter that April, paid in 3 installments because that was what she could manage, and told everyone at her church that the woman 2 farms over building safe rooms out of scrapyard drums wasn't running a hobby. She was running the only business in the county that had personally sat through the thing it was selling protection from. Janne kept that conversation in her notebook, word for word, the way she kept her load calculations. She said later it did more to shape the business than anything she'd learned at Kansas State. Let me tell you about May of 2004 because it is the year the argument ended. Not with a speech, not with a spreadsheet, but with weather. On the evening of May 11, 2004, a tornado outbreak moved across 3 counties in central Kansas, and the worst of it tracked directly through the southern edge of Kestrel County, through the town of Marlin Junction, through open wheat ground, and within a half-mile of Renfrau Salvage and Metal itself. By that spring, Janne had built and sold 41 shelters across the county. 19 of them were occupied that night, everyone held. In Marlin Junction, a family of 5 rode out an EF3 in a Marsh shelter, built into their basement floor 18 months earlier, and came up afterward to find their house gone above them. Walls, roof, the kitchen table Janne herself had once sat at as a guest, and their shelter door, welded from drum steel Janne had sorted with a flashlight 5 years before, still sealed shut around them exactly as it should have been. Gideon Renfrau's own daughter and 2 grandchildren spent that night in a Marsh shelter 2 farms over. Because Gideon's own property had no cellar and his son-in-law had bought one from Janne, the previous fall against Gideon's mild objection that the county catalog units were the safer bet. Gideon drove out to the Marsh place 4 days after the storm, once the worst of the debris cleanup had cleared the county roads. He found Janne in the shed, sorting a fresh load of drums Dallas had hauled in from the yard. He stood in the doorway for a while before he said anything. Then he said that his granddaughters had been in one of her shelters, and that he'd spent the drive over trying to work out how to say what he needed to say, and hadn't landed on anything better than that he'd been wrong, plainly and completely wrong, back at that coffee counter in 1999. Janne set down her flashlight. She told him she appreciated it. Then she said, because she'd had 5 years to work out exactly what she wanted him to understand, that the lesson wasn't that drum steel beat catalog steel. The lesson was that a county sitting on 600 rusted barrels and a wind engineering problem had been treating both as separate facts instead of putting them together, and that after May 11th, nobody in Kestrel County had the luxury of making that mistake twice. Gideon didn't argue. He asked instead whether the yard's remaining drum stock, several hundred more, accumulated since the original pile Janne had already worked through, might be worth setting aside for her rather than ascending to the crusher. Janne said she'd take every one he could spare. Let me tell you what the business became, because the story doesn't end with one storm, and the numbers deserve to be told. By 2006, Marsh Shelter Fabrication, the name Janne had registered with the state in 2002, after Thaddeus told her Whitmore Marsh and daughter-in-law wouldn't fit on a sign, employed 6 people full-time. Janne, Dallas, 2 additional welders, Thaddeus part-time handling logistics and the books he'd insisted on learning after retirement, and a shipping and installation coordinator. They'd moved out of the machine shed into a proper 3,600 square foot fabrication building built on the back 40 in 2005, funded partly by the business's own retained earnings and partly by a rural development loan the county's small business office had helped Janne secure, the same office that, in the fall of 2006, invited her to speak at its annual summit in front of roughly 200 farmers, insurance agents, and county officials, Gideon Renfrow among them. She didn't need slides of the storm. Everyone in that room had lived through May 11th. What she showed instead was a simple 3-line table. Units sold in 2001, 11. Units sold in 2004, the year of the outbreak, 68. Units sold in 2006, 140. Annual revenue for 2006 came to $280,000, against a materials cost for drum steel that year of under $6,000. Because Renfrow's yard, and by then 2 neighboring scrapyards as well, were setting drums aside for her rather than hauling them to the crusher, and charging her next to nothing for the privilege of not paying a tipping fee. The room didn't gasp. It did something quieter. The particular stillness of people revising an old certainty in real time, the same stillness Thaddeus wore in the back row that day. In his good jacket, watching his daughter-in-law finish a sentence he never could have predicted the year his son died. Let me tell you about what came after, because the story isn't really about a revenue figure, and the part that follows is the part that explains what all of it was actually for. In 2008, the Kestrel County Emergency Management Office formally adopted Janne's Drum and Earth shelter design as the county's recommended residential safe room standard, the first county in the state to do so. In 2011, at the request of 2 neighboring counties whose emergency managers had heard about Kestrel's outbreak survival numbers, Janne began training independent fabricators under a licensed design program so that farms sitting on their own forgotten drum piles could build shelters for their own communities rather than shipping raw scrap 2 counties away. She never patented the design. Otis Behrens, before he died in 2009, told her that A thing meant to save your neighbor's life shouldn't have a toll booth on it. And Janne never found a reason to disagree. Janne's daughter, Della, was 11 years old on the night of May 11th, 2004, old enough to remember the 4 minutes it once took to force open a swollen cellar door, and old enough 16 years later to enroll in civil engineering at Kansas State, with a folder of her mother's welding logs and a question about whether the same overlapping shell principle could be scaled up to reinforce small rural schools against direct hits, buildings the state's current codes still treated as ordinary construction. Janne read the folder at the kitchen table, where Thaddeus had once told her to clear out the west end of the shed. She didn't need to think about it. Kestrel County still sits under the same wide sky it always has. The wheat still comes up every spring, and the drums still arrive from the yard when a farm 2 counties over finds an old pile it doesn't know what to do with. The fence line behind the machine shed is nearly empty now. Most of 600 barrels long since cut, cleaned, and buried under Kansas ground, holding up roofs over families who never knew the metal's first life, only its second one. Corinne Byler still sends Janne a Christmas card every year, a decade and a half after that first April installment. It usually says some version of the same thing, that the shelter never had to prove itself again after 2004 because nobody in that stretch of the county ever doubted it in the first place. Dallas Whitfield is still running the welding bay, training the 2 apprentices Janne hired after the county training program expanded in 2015. Thaddeus Marsh died in 2013, 81 years old, having spent his last good years doing the books for a company he'd once agreed to only because he couldn't bring himself to tell his son's widow no. At his funeral, Gideon Renfrow stood in the receiving line and told Janne that Thaddeus had once said, quietly and without much fuss, that watching her build something out of a pile of rust was the first thing that had made him believe the farm still had a future worth showing up for. Janne has never moved the original shelter behind the machine shed, the overbuilt 6-person unit from 1998 that took 11 weeks and more welds than it needed. It still holds Della's old bicycle and a shelf of canning jars, and every May before the season turns, Janne still walks out and checks the door. It has never once stuck. They laughed at the scrap pile once. Nobody in Kestrel County laughs at it anymore.